Well, the point I'm trying to make, Secretary, is that if this is so important to the military, and you as Secretary of the Department of Defense should know more about the border. Mr. Secretary, I urge you to skip the photo ops next time that you go to a port of entry and spend time on the ground in places like the Diamond Day Ranch.
I think you should ask the soldiers on the border whether they've been photo op visits or not, because I spent a lot of time on the ground with the soldiers, getting an understanding of what they're facing, what they're doing, what their capabilities are.
Secretary, I reclaim my time.
Thank
you. Secretary, I reclaim my time.
Understand what our troops do. And
what we saw in that hearing was only the beginning, a glimpse of the bigger confrontation that followed. Congressman Gabe Vasquez of New Mexico, a man who has lived his entire life on the border, delivered a striking challenge to the Defense Secretary during what should have been a routine oversight session. This was no ordinary back and forth over budgets or party priorities. It was about something deeper, credibility. Drawing from his firsthand experience, Vasquez highlighted the difference between someone who has lived the realities of border life and a Washington official whose understanding is limited to carefully staged photo ops. As Vasquez pressed with pointed questions, the Defense Secretary struggled to keep up, exposing how disconnected he truly was from the situation on the ground. Unlike many politicians who rely on polished sound bites, Vasquez spoke with the urgency of someone representing real people and real struggles. He came across not as a figure parroting rehearsed lines, but as a genuine advocate for his community and its challenges. And that authenticity underscored the weight of his critique.
I recognize the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Vasquez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I understand that the border is a top priority for you and the Department of Defense. Well, it's also one of my top priorities in my border district. That's why I've introduced bipartisan legislation to stop fentanyl at the border, secure our ports of entry, hire more CBP personnel, and combat the cartels, areas that I'm sure we agree on. Now, DOD has spent more than $525 million from the defense budget on military operations on the border. You've done it by diverting over $1 billion from military modernization and quality of life programs like housing. And as such, I'm sure you're well informed as to what your warfighters are doing on our border and the characteristics of the border itself. Secretary Hegseth, do you know how many border miles there are in New Mexico?
Not the exact number of miles.
Can you give me a round figure?
Hundreds.
Okay, 180 miles. Can you tell me where the border wall starts and ends on this map of New Mexico?
It's not properly oriented to your map, but I know that unfortunately, because of the administration previous, they did not have the opportunity to finish the border wall.
Thank you,
let
Secretary.
It rust on the ground instead of
Thank you,
putting it up.
Secretary. And you have been to New
border.
Mexico. Could you tell me where in New Mexico you've been to?
I've been to the border twice to look at once at our national defense area down there because I can't recall a time when a Secretary of Defense has gone down in the first 4 or 5 months of his tenure to the border to better understand.
Was that in an urban area
there.
or in a rural area?
Both areas, traversed rural areas and urban
Okay,
areas.
so you must be
Some
familiar.
with walls, some without.
Secretary.
And if President Trump was
Secretary,
actually supported, we'd have a
Thank
border
you, Secretary. I reclaim my time. So the most remote part of New Mexico is called the Boot Heel. And I'm not sure that you spent any time in the Boot Heel of New Mexico. Mr. Secretary, I was raised on the border. I've lived there my whole life. I've worked alongside ranchers, farmers, landowners, wildlife biologists, and other stakeholders for over a decade. I headed a border security task force in my district before coming to Congress. I've traveled with Border Patrol on ATVs. I've hunted the border on horseback and hiked dozens of miles in the most remote stretches of the border in this region. Now, do you happen to know why there hasn't been a border wall built in the Boot Heel?
Well, based on what you just described, you should be a big fan of what our administration is.
Well, Secretary, I'm asking why a border wall has not been built. Funds have been allocated for other parts of the border.
Here's what I know. Our commanders on the ground and others and our engineers would understand what goes where and why, and where there should be a border wall, there will be a border wall.
Okay,
it will be funded through reconciliation.
Secretary, are you familiar with the Animas Mountains, with Alamo Hueco, with San Luis Mountains, with Guadalupe Pass or Long Canyon?
Again,
critical border areas.
I'm aware that there are gaps in different places where walls are not as effective as other places, and I get that.
Thank
We're
you,
applying
Secretary.
infrastructure
I appreciate your answer
where it
on that.
makes the most sense, because we're going to get 100% operational
Thank you,
control of the border.
Secretary. So you agree then that a border wall doesn't make sense for the entire country?
I think we need a border wall across our entire border.
Okay, so you should know then why it's almost physically impossible to build a border across the Animas Mountains and the terrain challenges that that poses and the billions of dollars. Do you know if there's roads on those mountains currently?
If we're going to spend money as a government,
Okay.
it should be
I'll take that as a no.
secure our southern border.
The point I'm trying to make, Secretary, is that if this is so important to the military, and you as Secretary of the Department of Defense should know more about the border. Mr. Secretary, I urge you to skip the photo ops next time that you go to a port of entry and spend time on the ground in places like the Diamond A Ranch.
I think you should ask the soldiers on the border whether they've been photo op visits or not, because I spent a lot
Secretary-
of time on the ground
Secretary,
with
are
the
you-
soldiers, getting an understanding of what
Secretary,
they're
I'm
facing,
gonna
what
ask
they're
you a
doing,
question
what
that-
their capabilities are.
Secretary, I reclaim my
Not for a
time.
photo op.
Thank you.
As a
Secretary, I
Secretary of
reclaim
Defense
my
to
time.
understand what our
Chairman,
troops
may I
do
reclaim my
and
time?
why.
Gentleman
they do
reclaims
it.
his time.
Thank you. Secretary, do you know what a tethered aerostat system is?
I do.
Okay. Well, great. Then you know that this type of surveillance technology is superior to having thousands of troops sitting in trucks looking at an empty desert. I've requested funds for more tethered aerostat systems. We haven't had a response from your department. Are you familiar with ASTs?
What's an AST?
Well, it's an autonomous surveillance tower. They're equipped with these advanced cameras that have the capability to relay critical information to border agents on the ground. And this type of technology is badly needed on the boot heel. And it's a much better expenditure than a border wall is.
I've seen that. I've seen those towers in use.
Great. Well, these technologies have been described to me by both Border Patrol and CBP as force multipliers, allowing their personnel to focus on law enforcement efforts while leaving this mundane surveillance task to much more efficient and cost-effective technology, a much more efficient way to surveil that part of the border. Now, Mr. Secretary, I have serious concerns with your fundamental lack of knowledge about the U.S.-Mexico border, considering the billions of dollars that DOD is slated to spend on this mission, with little clarity to those of us who live there. I would encourage you to do some homework on my region and learn what will actually make our border more secure and more safe. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
What unfolded in that room was no ordinary hearing. It wasn't another round of scripted exchanges or partisan sparring. It was a clash between lived experience and recycled slogans. On one side stood Congressman Gabe Vasquez of New Mexico, a man born and raised in a border district, someone who has walked the land, worked with ranchers and farmers, patrolled with border agents, and even led a local task force on security. For him, border policy isn't an abstract issue, it's personal. On the other side sat Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, armed with broad talking points, vague assurances, and carefully crafted lines that sound fine in Washington but collapse under scrutiny. From the opening moments, Vasquez cut through the rhetoric and went straight to the facts. He reminded the room that the Department of Defense had already diverted more than $1 billion away from modernization and troop housing to fund deployments at the border. Dollars meant to upgrade equipment, improve housing, and strengthen the lives of service members had instead been redirected to create militarized optics for political theater. Vasquez put it bluntly, every wasted dollar was a dollar stolen from readiness, modernization, and the soldiers themselves. And then he put the Secretary to the test, not with complex hypotheticals, but with the basics. How many miles of border run through New Mexico? Hegseth fumbled, guessed, and got it wrong. Vasquez corrected him. 180 miles. Basic geography, the kind of knowledge any policymaker serious about border issues should know. When Vasquez pulled out a map and asked the Secretary to identify where the wall starts and ends in New Mexico, Hegseth faltered again. The questions weren't trick questions. They were meant to expose whether Washington officials actually know the ground they make billion-dollar decisions about. And in this case, the answer was clear: they don't. The humiliation didn't end there. Vasquez pressed further. Where exactly in New Mexico had the Secretary visited? Hegseth admitted only to 2 vague trips. Shallow visits focused more on optics than understanding. Vasquez contrasted that with his own experience, raising the realities of regions like the Boot Heel, one of the most remote stretches of the border. He explained why a wall couldn't be built there. The terrain, the Animas Mountains, the Guadalupe Pass, Long Canyon, makes construction nearly impossible and prohibitively expensive. Geography itself renders the wall ineffective in certain places. Yet when asked, the Secretary had no real answer. And then came the pivot. After dismantling the slogans, Vasquez laid out solutions. He pointed to tools already requested by Border Patrol: tethered aerostat systems, surveillance balloons, autonomous towers equipped with sensors and cameras. These technologies multiply the reach of agents, allowing them to monitor wide areas, act quickly, and focus on real enforcement rather than staring at empty stretches of desert. Vasquez wasn't talking theory. He had already submitted funding requests for these technologies. Requests that, he revealed, the Department of Defense had ignored. By the time he finished, the contrast was undeniable. On one side, Vasquez, armed with lived experience, real numbers, and workable solutions. On the other, a defense secretary dodging basic questions and clinging to political optics. What Vasquez revealed wasn't just ignorance, it was a dangerous disconnect. Billions have been siphoned away from soldiers and modernization, poured instead into photo ops that do little to make the border safer. The congressman's closing message was clear. If Washington is going to spend billions on border operations, the very least it can do is understand the land, the communities, and the needs of the people who actually live there. This wasn't political theater, it was a wake-up call. Vasquez showed the difference between a policymaker who has lived the reality and one who only repeats slogans. And the real question left hanging in the air was this: why is Washington still funding political optics instead of practical solutions? People who live on the border know what works. They know the terrain. They know the challenges. What's missing isn't the technology, the tools, or the expertise. What's missing is the political will to prioritize effectiveness over theater. Until that changes, billions will continue to be wasted, families will remain vulnerable, and communities like those in New Mexico will carry the cost. If you found this breakdown insightful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because there's much more to uncover